If he saw any of the ceremonies in the kivas of the snake and antelope clans, it escaped Bert Cowing's notice. As to his reaction in the tiny plaza when the dancers gathered about Snake Rock and 80 reptiles, many of them rattlesnakes, were released, Cowing has since written, "I do not recall any special comment by him, but I am sure that we all expressed in one way or another how much we felt the serious spirit of the Hopis about this ceremony, in contrast to the rather fantastic effect some of it had upon the whites." The opening part of the ceremony, when the priests of the two clans faced each other before the kisi, or shelter of green branches where the snakes were hidden, moved Richard and the others quite as much as the succeeding stage, when the snake priests circled the plaza in a shuffling dance step, the twisting reptiles held between their lips, tails of larger snakes dragging in the dust. This part of the ceremony had no lack of drama, but the opening chant of the snake priests, their bodies daubed in black soot, kilted in buckskin and foxtails, and wearing a spread of red-dyed eagle feathers in their loose hair, had an equally powerful effect. Chanting, while they bent forward, swaying with arms interlocked before the kizi and the facing line of antelope priests, the rhythm of their slow movement was nearly hypnotic, and in itself somehow snake-like. Nuances of tone in this singular little deep-chested Hopi snake chant, sung only to the dry swish of gourd rattles and stamp of moccasined feet, was deeply moving. Bert Cowing was fascinated as he watched the brief final phase of the ceremony. Hardly noticed by the throng of onlookers, the chief of the snake clan had outlined a circle with cornmeal at one corner of the plaza opposite the kisis, where the antelope priests still stood in a line shaking their rattles. As the outline was completed, several old women stepped forward and filled the circle with more of the white meal. Quite suddenly the dancers moved forward and dropped their snakes onto the circle of cornmeal, burying it under this writhing, tangled mass. Then each of them in turn plunged his arm fearlessly into the swarm to clutch as many of the snakes as his hands could grasp. Snatched thus until the circle was cleared, the snakes were carried on the run out of the plaza, down from the mesa to the 4 sacred directions of the desert below. There the snakes were released, it being understood that on their return to the underworld they would tell how well they had been treated by the Hopi sons, and carry with them the prayers for rain and good harvest. On this occasion the prayers were not answered immediately, nor for some days afterwards. A wind of gale force whistling across the mesa during the final moments of the ceremony filled the sky with ominous clouds, but when the sun went down 2 hours later, it was still dry in the streets of Walpi, and the evening star glittered brightly. The visitors who had made such a stir with their arrival now moved quietly about their departure. All but a few were gone by the time the moon came up. Walpi faded back on its rock into the night. Richard and his friends remained stretched out in their bedrolls on Tom Polke's rooftop. Only a few points of light here and there proved the villages were not entirely asleep or deserted. The pueblo of Oraibi on the third mesa was oldest and largest of the 7 Hopi villages, with a population of nearly 800. Because the pueblo was built well back from the rim of the mesa, it was not convenient for the women of the Orabi to toss their refuse and sweepings over the cliff. Instead, they used several refuse jumps just beyond the outer tier of the houses, or, failing that, an abandoned room or kiva. For this reason, the smells of Oraibi were more pungent, the flies more numerous than any of the other villages. Richard's party rode into Oraibi on the day following the snake dance, and in a short time secured a room, not to sleep in, but as a place for storing packs and saddles. The late August nights were still warm enough to make the open rooftops inviting. Early the next day, Richard and Clayton left with Dr. Pruden, whose work now called him back to New York. They took him to the railroad stop at Winslow, some 60 miles across the sandy desert. Richard and Clayton returned 3 days later, and as a streak of gold rimmed the sky on the morning following, they left the sleeping Pueblo with only a drowsy dog or two to notice their departure. Once a wagon road leading down from the Mesa was behind them, they prodded their horses to a lope, anxious to travel as fast as possible in the cool early hours. At Keams Canyon, they stopped in the shade of a cottonwood beside the store of a well-known English trader who had given his name to the place, Thomas V. Keene, while Richard inquired about hiring a guide. He found a young Navajo who said he knew all the country well and would, on one condition, take them by way of Shinle Valley to within a short distance of where the Mancos River flows into the San Juan. The Indian gravely said his name was George Washington, and then explained that if he were to go, his wife must be permitted to go with them. The Navajo woman proved to be an excellent companion, if a silent one, during the long ride. A slender girl with a flashing white smile, she gave no sign of tiring, and, in fact, sometimes set the pace herself, that had Muldoon Kelly muttering through clenched teeth. In her attitude toward her husband, his toward her, there was something that puzzled Richard, and then made him smile, because these two showed none of the reserve Navajo couples usually assume among strangers. Also noticing this, Bert Cowing wrote that the pair were very loving. I mean, they acted more like a newly married couple than would be expected at that stage of the proceedings. He handed her onto her horse every time in the politest possible manner. Toward the evening of the second day, they were in close range of the Carrizo Mountains, the trading post in the foothills, when the Navajo said the hogan of his father was only a short distance off. He asked them to go there with him and stop for the night. Richard and the others readily agreed, Muldoon Kelly expressing particular pleasure at the idea of parting from his saddle. When they rode up to the hogan, George Washington and his wife were greeted warmly by his mother and two sisters, who then turned to welcome the four white men. His father was not there, but Bert Cowing told what happened on the old man's return. Seems George Washington had been away from home for 5 years, and when he had been sitting in the hogan for some time, the father came in. George Washington was seated by his squaw on the ground, and his father came in. Both their faces brightened up, and the father advanced and took his hand and sat down on the right side of him, putting his arm affectionately around his neck. The squaw, meantime, came around the other side of the old man and put his arm around her neck, and for a moment they remained silent, the father apparently saying a blessing, all of them having their heads bowed. It was very quietly done, but it was done in a way to remove all doubt that the Indians have natural affection. They were sitting in this manner when the howling windstorm came upon them, driving the sand in a thick brown curtain. The storm's fury caught them unaware, Cowing said. We hardly had time to fix our packs and saddles before we were covered with sand. As soon as possible, we crawled into the hogan. This one was pretty spacious, but it got pretty close after a while in spite of the hole for a chimney. For over an hour it blew to beat everything. When the sand stopped, it began to rain, and that lasted a half an hour or more. Darkness having followed closely on the rain, the women set about building a fire and preparing food. After they had eaten, Cowing wrote, The girls roasted corn on the coals for us, and I assure you it was very fine, but they made the queerest compound. When they got through with their fire in there, they pushed the coals aside, and on the warm sand beneath they laid green corn leaves, smoothed out and overlapping each other a little. On this, the old woman laid a sort of mush, which was merely soft, fresh corn ground into a meal like ground corn. Then it made a cake about 2 feet by 10 inches square and an inch or a little more thick. Over this she put more corn leaves, and over them sand, and on top of that hot coals, and the bread was left to bake in the coals all night. Richard and his companion started on the last stage of their journey early the next morning, crossing several dry washes, skirting the slopes of the Carrizos, and then riding in merciless noon heat through the grotesque formations of Red Rock Valley until they finally came to Nolan's trading post on the San Juan. Sweat plastered their shirts to their backs and was running in rivulets from their dust-caked faces when they dismounted in front of Nolan's and walked through the doorway into the store's cool darkness. On the counter was the usual communal water bucket and dipper, but Muldoon Kelly's eyes lighted thoughtfully on a pile of watermelons off in one corner. He would have one of them, he thought. He did, and then another, and perhaps a third. He was a man of great thirst. The ride from Nolan's store to the Alamo Ranch was a nightmare for the editor. Either the watermelons had not quite ripened, or Muldoon had been too greedy. In any case, his complexion soon matched the color of the discarded melon rinds. At some point during the afternoon, Mr. Kelly could ride no further. They stopped at a ranch where the Wetherill brothers knew the people and hired a rig. Groaning but still game, Muldoon was boosted in the carriage seat, the reins put in his hands, and the journey proceeded relentlessly into the gathering dusk. The massive outline of Mesa Verde was only darker than the sky when the riders finally entered Mancos Valley. That day they had covered a distance of 60 miles.
New York City, get me to the farm.